All right. Thanking and praising God for the way in which he can help us see the connections between stories that are thousands of years old and today. Let's call chapter 11 of Matthew Canceled, understanding that it's literally going to talk about the violence done to the kingdom in some, I guess, literal and maybe metaphorical ways. But the way in which that violence is done reminds me a lot of what we call today cancel culture, as the chapter will ultimately offer an appeal to those who are seeking rest. And one of the reasons why it might have reminded me of cancel culture is it is a culture where no matter where you sit on the spectrum of being the canceler or the one being canceled, it just seems to be an exhausting culture for everyone. And that seems to be exactly what God is describing as Christ and John experiencing in this chapter, and what Christ is providing a relief from by the time we get to the end. But first of all, just a basic, once again, attempt to make just a general summary in the hopes of getting through this in roughly 5 minutes. The first roughly 17 verses, 18 verses, how many? Let's just take the first paragraph. First, 19 verses are going to talk about John in maybe 3 ways. First of all, John is going to send his apostles with a question to the Christ in the first 6 verses or so. After that, in verses 7 through roughly 15, he is going to give the crowds to whom he was talking before the messengers from John came. He's going to turn his attention back to them and talk about John, at which point he's going to seem to talk about this generation in the passage that probably reminds me most of cancel culture in verses 16 through 19. However, his discussion of cancel culture is going to extend into an address to some cities that he seems to have done works in that were ignored. Understanding that in verses 20 through 24, he's going to compare the cities of his day to cities that had famous destruction or came to a famous end. He's going to say the end of those cities that were basically held up, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah, as the picture of wickedness and failure. They're going to be better than some of the cities he has done work in his day. Understanding that the chapter is going to close out with the optimistic note, saying that those who are exhausted by the situation they find themselves in what I'm calling this cancel culture, can come to him for rest. In the famous passage, it says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden." With that, the points that might have caught my attention most, starting back at the beginning, are the context. Understanding that it is set in verse 1 after Jesus has instructed his apostles or disciples, as I think they were still referred to specifically in the last chapter, and he has sent them out in verse 2. It's when the messengers from John the Baptist come, and the question basically is, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? The thing that stood out to me about Jesus' answer to John was the part. It seems almost like a line that doesn't fit. Verse 6, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." I always thought that was more of a generic statement, but he's saying that specifically in the message he's sending back to John, helping me to, or causing me to wonder whether or not he understands that John, much like the rest, did not necessarily understand the form in which the kingdom was going to come, and some of the things that he might have said that have gotten him in trouble with Herod, as we'll see in chapter 14, might have come because his boldness was rooted in his expectation that the Christ was going to hold him down, as we are saying today. But he now finds himself in jail, and this is all speculation from me, quite possibly disappointed at the way things have turned out now that he has been so bold in his approach and having been delivered so much, as Christ is going to say when he begins to talk about John, saying that he was Elijah, the one who was taken up to heaven without having to see death in the old covenant. He may now be disappointed at where he finds himself preaching during a time when the one he thought was the Messiah was now present. Thus his question. And after Jesus sends the response to him, as we said, he is going to go and talk to the crowd about John, showing him respect in a number of ways that are actually going to give us insight into the kingdom, saying that John's a great man. No one born of woman is greater than he, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater. Understanding that there are many who have, as he's going to describe it, have tried to take the kingdom by force in some translations. Thus, our whole concept of the canceling, understanding that as great as John was, he was not a fit with those who had authority over the physical kingdom of Israel in the time that Jesus has come. But the thing that they share in common is going to go from verses 16 on through verse 19, where he's going to say they didn't like John, and he came in what we would call austerity. He's not eating or drinking. The Christ came in the fullness of the freedoms that God gave him, and they say he's a glutton. The bottom line is the only thing that seems to please this generation is agreeing with the people of that generation. Thus, cancel culture, because we live in a time now where you can easily find yourself at odds with anyone with whom you do not agree. And sometimes the favorite go-to move is cancellation, depending upon how offended folks choose to be. Quite possibly reminding me that, as we said at the outset, things might not have changed all that much, as Jesus earlier on in the chapter is going to say, blessed is the one who is not offended by me, because offense is going to seem to be the justification for this generation to dismiss both John and Jesus. Likewise, as he goes through those cities in verses 20 through 24, he's going to talk about the cities that were offended or for whatever reason rejected the work that Jesus did there, even though the works he did there were flat out miracles, saying that had those miracles been done in notoriously wicked places like Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have stood to this day. Going on, though, he does not leave it there, because even though the prognosis is bleak, he is saying within this culture where it can seem difficult to find a genuine fit with anyone who you don't compromise yourself to agree with, he can provide you rest. In the larger context of the Bible, with the caveat that you genuinely open yourself to the truth. Understanding that as easy as it can be for me to recognize the lies of the dishonesty that I see in others, it can be just as difficult to acknowledge the dishonesty that I find comforting in a way. However, the caveat is in defending comforting lies, reality can be an exhausting thing to keep at bay. The excuses, the spin, all the things that I need to insulate my self-esteem from the truth can be just as exhausting as the lies that I find so tiring from others. And so just from the perspective of truth and integrity, the rest that he provides not only gives me relief from the lies that are like nails scratching on a chalkboard to my ears, but he gives me, and he honestly gives us all, relief from the ways in which we have all, in some way, quite possibly begun to scratch our nails on that chalkboard too. And God willing, over time, he helps us to become less tone deaf regarding the clever but faulty things we've begun to accept as true.